We need a revolution. I would say that, but a peaceful revolution brings us back to the values that have been robbed from us over the past 40 years. The crisis has been, to some extent, co-opted by Bill Gates, by the World Economic Forum, in the same way that the COVID crisis was appropriated by them to make themselves richer, to impose totalitarian controls on society. Our democracy is devolving into kind of a corporate plutocracy. You go to the bailout of the Silicon Valley Bank, and the war in Ukraine, which is costing us $113 billion. The war in Iraq and the wars that followed that have cost us $8 trillion. The total cost of the lockdowns was $16 trillion. And we got nothing we didn't get anything for all those wars we fought. The $8 trillion, we got zero. We got worse. What we're being told about this war is just not true. We've printed 10 centuries of money in the last 14 years. 42 years old. I got struck with a disease, a neurological disease, an injury called spasmodic dystonia, and it makes my voice tremble. I think our country's headed in a bad direction, and that's why I'm running, but I can run against Trump better than anybody else can.
Do you think you could win?
I know I can win. I've come here today to announce my candidacy for the Democratic nomination for President of the United States. This is what happens when you censor somebody for 18 years.
Oh, they don't want to let RFK on a stage with Biden.
Yeah.
RFK will rip that old man up.
And what I was making a completely different point about the rise of the emerging rise of AI, of artificial intelligence and surveillance technologies, which was creating an infrastructure that in the future totalitarian systems would be able to surveil us and intrude and control our lives in ways that had never happened in the past. And now have clear evidence that there were White House personnel who were ordering the social media companies to censor me, and it had nothing to do with misinformation. In fact, nobody's been able to show a single statement that I've ever made on my Twitter or any social media that is factually inaccurate. So I think the political parties, both parties, ought to be doing everything that they can to convince the American public that we really have a democracy.
He's an interesting guy in a lot of ways. Because he was a vaccine skeptic way before the COVID vaccine. He's been a skeptic of vaccines in general. And a lot of people say that's this is a conspiracy theory or it's too far. But, that argument after COVID is really much weaker than it used to be. Because people are actually like, yeah, I'm listening now.
Yes.
Now I'm actually kind of listening to that guy.
It seems like there's a playbook, and you guys have been following this playbook forever.
Yes. And I got his speech, his announcement speech last week.
I've come here today to announce my candidacy for the Democratic nomination for President of the United States.
He spoke for over an hour, and it was really fantastic. I don't agree with everything the guy says, but the major theme of his speech was that there is this unholy alliance of big business and big government, and they're working together to screw over the American people.
Cześć. Kandydatura Roberta F. Kennedy'ego zasługuje moim zdaniem na uwagę. Jest on bardzo ostro cenzurowany i stracił większość swoich kont w social mediach, a mimo to kandyduje na prezydenta Stanów Zjednoczonych. Co takiego głosi? Postaram się wam tutaj przedstawić w kilku wycinkach z amerykańskiego internetu, bo uważam, że osoba ta zasługuje na dostrzeżenie także w Polsce i to, co głosi, z pewnością dla wielu osób, dla wielu organów jest bardzo niewygodne, więc zachęcam, jeśli lubicie taki niezależny przekaz, do powielenia, podania tej informacji dalej i zapoznania się z całym tym nagraniem.
And I can confront President Trump with the lockdowns, which no Democrat can. Lockdowns, he closed 3.3 million businesses. He closed 41% of the black-owned businesses in our country would never reopen again. This is a war on the poor. It was a war on minorities. It was the destruction of the middle class. I think that the general theme of my speech was this corrupt merger of state and corporate power, which is turning our country into a corporate kleptocracy, into a system of socialism for the rich, and this kind of a cushy socialism for the rich, and this kind of brutal, merciless capitalism for the poor. It keeps us in a state of war. It bails out banks at the same time that last month, the United States government told 30 million people it was cutting their their food stamp checks by 90%. It took 15 million people off of Medicare. The same month, it gave $300 million to the Silicon Valley Bank and tapped up the cost of the Ukraine war to $113 billion. We're sending $113 billion to the Ukraine. The entire budget of EPA is $12 billion. The budget of CDC is $11 billion. We have 57% of American citizens could not put their hands on $1,000 if they have an emergency. A quarter of our citizens are hungry. So we're cutting welfare and food stamps by 90%, and we're bailing out the bankers. We're paying for a war that, we can't afford. And with the way that we do this is by printing money. We've printed 10 centuries of money in the last 14 years.
And damned if anyone can argue that that's not true.
No,
that's just so obviously the case, And he went through this whole thing. He was really great on the war in Ukraine and being skeptical about what the hell are we doing here? Really, really great on the COVID stuff. And he's a Kennedy. And he's not just one of these peripheral Kennedys, I married a third cousin type Kennedy. He's Bobby Kennedy's kid.
Yeah. He was just 14 years old when his father, Robert F. Kennedy, was shot and killed while celebrating winning the Democratic presidential primary in 1968. 5 years earlier, his uncle, President John F. Kennedy, was assassinated whilst riding in a motorcade through Dallas.
Never before has a political assassination been subject to so much speculation. The death of US President John F. Kennedy. One of the darkest chapters in US history has generated its own library of conspiracy theories. But his nephew, Democrats' presidential hopeful Robert Kennedy Jr., says the CIA was responsible for the murder beyond any reasonable doubt.
November 22, 1963.
And the first unconfirmed reports say the president was hit in the head. That's an unconfirmed report that the president was hit in the head.
His nephew, Robert Kennedy Jr., photographed here with his uncle as a young boy in the Oval Office, has told Sky News the assassination is no mystery to him.
How do you align what you believe and what you know in terms of what actually happened?
The evidence, the mountain of evidence that the CIA was not only involved in my uncle's murder, but that but they were also managed the cover-up and continue to. They still won't release the last 5,000 documents. Is beyond any reasonable doubt. I'm an attorney. I've tried hundreds of cases. I have no doubt at all that I could try that case and convict certain members of the CIA, people, who were clearly involved in my uncle's death, whose names we know. Many of whom have made confessions. Many of them were deathbed confessions. We had a genuine assault on almost all of our Bill of Rights in our country. And the only amendment left was the Second Amendment. And for the people who feel strongly about the Second Amendment, they feel that the only reason that the entire Constitution was not taken away from them permanently was because they own their guns. It's not, and of the 72 vaccine doses now mandated, essentially mandated, they're recommended, but they're really mandated for American children, none of them, not one, has ever been subject to a pre-licensing placebo-controlled trial.
Yes, they have.
No.
Yes, they have.
Okay, let me just say something. Dr. Fauci and many other people for many years said this, that Bobby Kennedy, when he says that, is wrong. So I met with Dr. Fauci in 2016, and I agreed to go on Trump's Vaccine Safety Commission, and I was with Aaron Siri and Lynn Redwood and a number of other people, and we said to him, can you show us one test from any vaccine, pre-licensing safety test? And he said, I'll send it to you. I can't find one now. He never did. So we sued him. We sued Aaron Siri and I sued HHS. And after a year of litigation and stonewalling, they said that they could not provide a single safety study for any vaccine that is on the childhood schedule, pre-licensing safety study. So anybody who wants to read that can go to the Children's Health Defense website, and you can read HHS's admission that not a single one has ever been safety tested pre-licensing. Now, what I've said is other medicines are required to do that. And we should have to do that for vaccines. If I'm wrong, show me the test, show me the study. You won't be able to, because there are none. That means that we don't know what the long-term risks are, the risk profile of those products. And I'll give you mentioned chickenpox. So when CDC was thinking of recommending this chickenpox vaccine as mandating for children, they did a study, and the scientist they hired to do that study was a scientist called Gary Goldman, a contract scientist. And he did the study in an isolated place in California called Antelope Valley, a long-term study. And what they find is if you give the chickenpox vaccine, mass vaccinate with chickenpox, it stops chickenpox, but it causes shingles epidemics later on, which are 20 times as deadly as chickenpox.
Yeah, it was so quick. I mean, that lie was being pushed on mainstream news just a couple of years ago.
Well, dude, me and you were like talking about this stuff. It's like, it seems like not really that long ago, right? That we were having like some conversations where there'd be these clips of what we were saying, and it would be like, look at this COVID misinformation. Yeah. And now you're like, let's look back at that. Yeah. The World Health Organization is now saying that the vaccine shouldn't be given to kids. And the thing you said that was so controversial that Fauci had to comment on it was you were like, for young people, I don't know if I'd really tell you to take this vaccine. Just be really healthy. Say like eat really well, exercise, get a lot of sunlight. That was your dangerous misinformation that you were spreading.
Well, most recently, the networks all censored me, including this network. But most recently, and I think most offensively, the White House was asking the social media sites to censor me. There were also attorney generals, I think 18 or 13 Democratic attorney generals who contacted the social media sites and asked them specifically to censor me. But, we now have, because of the Twitter files and because of these email dumps, we now have clear evidence that there were White House personnel who were ordering the social media companies to censor me, and it had nothing to do with misinformation. In fact, nobody's been able to show a single statement that I've ever made on my Twitter or any social media that is factually inaccurate.
Lady, all of the policies that you put into place were built around that idea. The whole idea of vaccine mandates and vaccine passports and all of this was all predicated on the idea that it wasn't just your choice. Like, it wasn't just like, oh, you're choosing for your own health risk, that you were protecting other people. That was the whole idea that the whole thing was based on. If that's not true, then there was no justification for this. And millions of people lost their jobs over this. Yeah. Not to mention just the amount of people who were just like disenfranchised, like in major cities across the country. You couldn't go to a restaurant or couldn't go to a basketball game or whatever, which may seem less important than the ones who lost their job, but it's still fucked up.
It's all fucked up.
But if you cross that red line of telling the truth about, the capture of our agencies by pharmaceutical companies, that's not permitted. You're not permitted to talk about that in the U.S. media. Because I've spent 40 years litigating against the agencies, the regulatory agencies in the United States. So I can tell you that EPA is effectively run by the oil industry, the coal industry, and the pesticide industry. When we sued them, when I was on that trial team that brought the Monsanto cases, and we, ended up with a $13 billion settlement after winning 3 trials. But during those trials, we uncovered through discovery email traffic going back years that showed that the head of the pesticide division at EPA was secretly working for Monsanto and was running that agency to promote the mercantile ambitions of that business rather than the public interest. He was killing studies, he was fixing studies, he was ghostwriting studies, and that's true throughout the agencies. I mean, if you look at the pharmaceutical industry in our country, it runs FDA. FDA gets 50% of its budget from big pharma. The CDC spends half of its budget purchasing vaccines from big pharma, and then distributing it. So it is a partner, and NIH essentially is just an incubator for new pharmaceutical products. It doesn't really do the kind of basic research that we want them to be doing about where are all these diseases, these chronic diseases and allergic diseases coming from, and autoimmune disease and neurological disease. Why are we seeing this explosion? Now, those kind of studies don't get done. Studies that do get done are studies that develop pharmaceutical products, and then NIH collects royalties when the pharma company sells those products. So you have the regulator that, is essentially a partner with the regulated industry. The DOT is run by the railroads in our country and by the airlines. The banks have utterly corrupted the SEC. And of course, the media has corrupted the FEC.
And claims the president's foreign policies are being driven by the same ideology that led to the Iraq invasion in 2003.
It was, at that time, the worst foreign policy error in American history. It was a preemptive war against somebody who had done nothing to the United States. There was kind of these vague allegations that maybe he had something to do with 9/11, which he clearly did not. That he may be involved with Al-Qaeda, which he was not. That he may have had weapons of mass destruction. And based upon all of these rumors, we invaded the country and we killed 1 million Iraqis, and we left a mess where the country has no cohesion. It's a battle between Shia and Sunni death squads, and we pushed it into turning it essentially into a proxy for Iran, which is exactly the foreign policy objective we had not to do for 40 years previously. It was a catastrophe and it led ultimately to the wars in Syria and Yemen and Pakistan, Afghanistan. It was a crazy project from the beginning, and they ended up doing just the opposite. And now the same people are back in Washington in the Biden White House, the exact same neocons who, had been ostracized and exiled after the war in Iraq, and they've orchestrated this war in the Ukraine. And by the way, I support the humanitarian aid to the Ukraine, but Mr. Zelensky and the Ukrainian people are almost as much victims of the neocons in the White House that are today crushing the Ukraine in a proxy war between two great powers to serve these kind of global machinations that they've been up to since 2014. And so we've sacrificed 300,000 Ukrainian soldiers, young people, more than 300,000, who are the flower of Ukrainian youth, to achieve a goal that can't be achieved.
So do you think Russia will win the war in Ukraine?
I think Russians are winning the war. Yes, I believe the Russians will win the war. I think the Russians can't afford to lose that war.
There will be a lot of people who will be surprised to hear that you have that belief that Putin will be victorious.
I mean, look at militarily what's been happening there so far. And I'm very frightened for what's going to happen next, because I think, as soon as the rainy season is over and the wet season, that you're going to see a Russian offensive. And I don't think that the Ukrainian government or the American government are being honest about the costs, about the casualties, and about our role in it. We were told this was a humanitarian mission. And then President Biden said, well, the real mission is to depose Vladimir Putin. And his Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, in April 2022, said that the purpose of the war is to exhaust the Russian forces, to make them incapable of making war anywhere else in the world.
So
that is the opposite of a humanitarian mission. A humanitarian mission means reducing the bloodshed, ending the conflict. What the neocons who are running the White House want is to exhaust the Russian army and depose Vladimir Putin, and that is not going to happen. And listen, I know who Vladimir Putin is. He's a thug and he's a gangster, but that's a different question. Are we actually helping the Ukraine by encouraging and by sacrificing all their young men on the battlefield? I don't think so. Institutional problems in our country where something my uncle discovered in 1961, when he said what he realized during the Bay of Pigs crisis is that the CIA had devolved into an agency whose function was to provide the military-industrial complex with a constant pipeline of new wars. And my uncle came out of one of those meetings as the Bay of Pigs invasion collapsed, and he realized the CIA had lied to him, and he fired, ultimately, Alan Dulles, the head of the CIA, Charles Cabell, Richard Bissell, the three top people of the CIA, for lying to him. But he said at that time, I want to take the CIA and shatter it into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the wind. We have to recognize that, it's not just our civilian agencies that have been captured by industry. The military agencies, the Pentagon, and particularly the intelligence agencies have been captured by the military-industrial complex. And, and we have to recognize that, and we have to say, okay, we don't want constant wars in our country. We can't afford them. And I don't do things that I would like to do. I'm not going to be stupid. And I know the risks that are out there so very clearly, and I'm not going to be stupid about it. And I intend to be successful. I don't have a plan B.